Alright, so when it comes to design techniques, there's a few that are mainly used during the rendering process. So if you look at our list here, there's a couple that you may have been wondering about, and they're right at the top. And that's because they're really important. It's the greatest area of contrast, or GAC, and figure ground relationship, or FGR for short. So they're really, really important, but they're only realized usually when we start to add value. So let me show you what the techniques look like real quick on a scrap piece of sketch paper. So since we're drawing on a white background, the darkest mark and the largest mark will be the GAC. It's always, doesn't matter how big or small or whatever, but in relative comparison to other marks on the piece of paper, that's how you measure it. So this little mark here, it's the only mark on our paper, so it's the GAC. So it's the darkest and the largest mark. If we have one that's slightly bigger, that becomes the GAC. So it's larger and it's the same value, but it's larger. And then we can keep going and going and going. So you usually measure the GAC by what's darkest, what has the most contrast. And I'm saying darkest because we're on blank white background. Now if we had value here, you always got to keep simultaneous contrast in mind, because if we have value here, then we lay down the same darkness there, it still doesn't have as much contrast as the dark mark on the white paper, because we're surrounded by another value here. So that's the definition of the GAC, and that'll come in handy when we start rendering our drawing. We're going to try and make the snail the GAC. One other thing to keep in mind when you're rendering is it doesn't matter how big that GAC is. You can have your entire drawing light, rendered lightly like this, and you can have just a few touches, a few accents to draw attention to the main subject, and that's all you need. It's the contrast that draws our eyes first, so that's how you can control it, whether you want to add a lot or a little. Now when you have a drawing that's rendered completely and it's full of value, like chiaroscuro, like a Rembrandt or Caravaggio painting, and say the background's just really dark, the GAC becomes whatever is the lightest and the largest amount. Because everything's dark, that contrast of the white dot is going to draw our eyes first. Okay? So if the background's dark, you're going to look for the lightest value to create that contrast to draw the eyes. And if the background's light, like our drawing here, then you're going to want to create the dark marks to draw the eye and create that contrast. Alright, so that's the GAC. So another technique that is mainly realized when we start to render is figure ground relationship, and that's a really important one because it helps with visual clarity, helps define the subject, because you're paying attention to the foreground and the background and how they interact with each other. It's really, really important. So we've been using it this whole time because the snail doesn't have anything in the background. It's kept separate. All the leaves have been kept separate. We haven't added any background elements to confuse those shapes. But if you, in your own design, decided to add tall grass behind the snail, you're going to want to be cautious of how you render that, because if you render the tall grass too dark and then the snail is on top of it, you're going to get some visual confusion there. Say this is our snail. And he's coming down here, and if you start to add dark marks behind it, it's confusing that shape. Now if you wanted to add tall grass behind it, you want to keep it low contrast and really light. So say this is our snail again. Okay, and then you can add really light value behind it, and that won't mess with the figure ground relationship. So you always got to keep the contrast in mind and keep that figure to ground relationship in mind so you don't confuse the image. You want visual clarity. That's a really, really important goal for the overall drawing. And now if you're creating just line work, say you're not planning on rendering any value, you're just creating line work, you still want to pay attention to figure ground relationship and your greatest area of contrast. So figure ground relationship in line work is pretty simple also. Say this is our snail. You still want to keep it separate. Any line work like we've been doing, if we didn't render that, you know, that's just line work basically, most of it. So if this is your snail and you want to draw grass around it, you definitely want to try and keep those shapes separated. That way the snail's still visually clear. Because if you're doing line work, say you're using ink or whatever, you can vary the line of the ink, thick to thin, but if you're not cross-hatching or adding value, you need to depend on the line to define the shape. So if you're adding lines coming, the same value lines coming out of the snail, behind the snail, you can see how it's starting to confuse that shape. It's starting to blend in with the background. So figure ground relationship's really, really important. You should always keep that in mind when you're starting the composition, and before you render it, make sure it looks good too. Alright, so the other technique that is mainly realized when we start to render is aerial perspective, and we saw that come into play with the light tall grass in the background and the foreground. We kept that really low in contrast to create that fogginess, like it's on a foggy day. So a lot of movies you'll see smoke in the background, and they're creating that depth with the fog, the smoke. When people smoke cigarettes, you'll see the smoke going in front of their face, or it's in the background and creating an atmosphere. Whenever you get that contrast reduced, doesn't matter what particles are creating that reduction in contrast, like it could be rain, it could be snow, it could be just long distances in the mountainside. Whatever is creating that, we call that aerial perspective. And it could be lighting effects. Say your environment's really dark, like a Rembrandt or Caravaggio, and you're creating those lighting effects, so you're getting lost edges and the face starts blending into the background. That's creating that depth and that atmosphere. And where shadow meets shadow, that's reducing the contrast there, and it's creating that effect, that aerial perspective effect. So that's a really important one to keep in mind also. So we'll show you right here just how it works. So our paper is light, so any dark marks are going to come forward. The darker it is and larger it is, the more it's going to come forward. So that's our dark mark. And you can see this one looks like it's further back, and then this one is even lighter. You might not even be able to see it on camera, but you can increase that illusion by raising them up in the frame and making them get smaller. So it's all an illusion. Getting smaller and lighter and raising up in the composition. And you can continue to add that depth in that fashion as well. Alright, so that's aerial perspective. And we can look at this drawing by Proudhon. He's got all three techniques combined in one drawing. He's adding aerial perspective, he's got figure ground relationship, and then he's drawing us to the main subject with the GAC. So you can see how he's controlling the contrast, directing the eyes where they need to be, and then defining the subject with clear foreground and background interaction. So that's the techniques that we realize when we render mostly, but say figure ground relationship needs to be planned out in the beginning, so does the greatest area of contrast. You kind of need to know where you want to place your main subject and where that main focal point and contrast is going to go. Alright, so that's GAC, FGR, and aerial perspective. Next up, we'll learn about some stylistic marks, and then we can get into rendering.